fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. Fog, written by Carl Sandburg and first published in 1916, is a short poem. At 6 lines and 21 words in length, it is something you can read in just a few seconds. It doesn't have any particularly difficult or high-level wording, and it covers a simple concept, that being fog rolling in over a harbor and a city. Despite how brief and outwardly simple this poem is, Fog still stands as a very famous example of American poetry, and is one that helped propel the career of Carl Sandburg as one of the country's greatest poets and writers during his lifetime. At his death in 1967, the president at the time cited that Carl Sandburg was more than the voice of America, more than the poet of its strength and genius. He was America. Poetry is unique when compared to other types of writing. Poems can be long, they can be short, and they can be somewhere in between. Some poems can end up being massive book-sized projects, such as classic examples like epic poems, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey. There are also many examples of famous poems that are shorter in length than Fog is, including ones we referenced in other videos, like Dreams by Langston Hughes. So consider how it is being a poet and choosing to write a short poem, or maybe only having enough time to write something short on your way to or from a place. You have limited time, you have limited space. You need to make every word count. You need to pay extra attention to your word choice. Poets have been putting themselves into situations that restrict the amount of words they can use intentionally for a long time. Consider haiku, a short-form type of poetry from Japan that's been around for centuries. You've probably written one of these for a class at some point before. Traditional haiku has no more than 17 syllables, must have only 3 lines, and is typically patterned so that the first line has 5 syllables, the second has 7 syllables, and the third has 5 syllables. When you begin restricting syllables, you obviously begin restricting words. With this restriction, though, comes a new type of freedom. When you have set limits, you begin to consider very carefully the words you are going to use. A haiku is meant to show rather than tell. The author of it wants to pull you into a scene, often showing something from nature or the seasons, and create an image that sticks with you beyond when you're done reading it. Word, sound, and the image begin to mix into something you can't separate. Hearing a haiku can be like seeing a painting in your mind, but then actually stepping into that painting and hanging out wherever it's taking place. Next, we'll read a poem by Matsuo Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694 and is considered by many to be the greatest master of haiku. On a leafless branch, a crow comes to rest. Autumn nightfall. One of the nice things about reading a haiku is that you are probably immediately going to know what it's about. A haiku is going to transport you to a moment in time that is understandable because it is relatable. When we read a haiku like this, we immediately begin forming the picture Basho wanted us to. A crow flying in and coming to rest on the branch of a tree, with evening arriving and the cool, crisp air of autumn, easily felt. You're going to clearly understand the picture a haiku is trying to paint even centuries after the poet has passed away, and after that haiku has had to be translated from another language. One of the reasons why you probably started studying poetry when you were very young by reading a haiku or writing one is because of its simplicity, and also its relatability. The words within the haiku are ones you've known since you were very young, and the scenes the haiku is going to bring up are ones you and every other person on the planet have probably experienced at least some variation on. Keep these in mind as we move forward. A haiku uses careful word choice. It seeks to preserve a moment in time for anyone to experience later. It also creates a lasting picture. And a haiku should be simple, clear, and easy to understand by just about anyone. It doesn't matter what form of poetry you're writing, you want to make every word count. And this extends beyond poetry. Try to pay attention to every word you're using and question whether it is the right word for the right job. Let's explore some ways that we can make sure we're using the words we need to in our writing. First piece of advice, and one that will help in poetry and all types of writing, is to choose words that you understand well. This may seem obvious, but make sure that you understand a word before you make use of it. Don't try to sound overly academic. If you're trying to use words that sound smart or sound fancy, you may just end up sounding confused. Let's look at an example paired with a haiku that we looked at earlier. You've probably written something and then went in during revision later to try to replace words that you've used too frequently, or words that you thought could be replaced by maybe a stronger version of that word. That's awesome and will fit in with some of the advice we'll go over soon. Unfortunately, what a lot of people do is they try to find synonyms for words that they've put in their writing and try to replace them, and instead they end up putting in words that don't mean exactly what they think they mean, or they end up making their work sound tonally off. Let's replace some of the words in this haiku with synonyms that show up when you Google some of those words. So, for example, leafless becomes uncovered, branch becomes section, rest becomes slumber, and autumn becomes harvest. All of these are words that come up when looking for synonyms. So the poem then becomes, on an uncovered section, a crow comes to slumber, harvest nightfall. While that may sound okay, some of the words don't have the same meaning there that they once did. Leafless and uncovered mean somewhat the same thing, but they create a different picture. Section does not mean the same as the branch we're thinking of. We're thinking of the branch of a tree, whereas this would be more of a synonym for a branch of government when we use the word section. Slumber implies sleep, whereas rest could just be coming to sit on something or taking a break. And while autumn and harvest both can be kind of interchanged, I tend to think of a different picture when I'm picturing harvest season. In this case, I've changed the haiku too much. It's almost nonsensical at this point. Some of it still works, but some of it doesn't. Alright, tip 2. You usually want to avoid repetition. And while repetition can work sometimes for things like alliteration, repeating the same word over and over and over again can really get old. Look at this example. The student has the highest grades in the class because he is the hardest working student out of all of the students. Compare that with this sentence. The student has the highest grades in the class because he spends more time working and studying than his peers do. While both sentences technically work, the first one is very awkward just because of the amount of times that student is used. So for this tip, just avoid using the same word over and over and over again when you can. Again, there may be a situational need for repetition in your poem, but judge carefully when you do that. Next tip is that sometimes words are unnecessary. What I mean by that isn't that we can just plop a sheet of paper down completely blank and say it's a poem. I mean that sometimes simplifying a statement can make things flow a lot better, or make a part of your poem or the essay you're writing a lot easier to read for your audience. Look at our 2 examples here. The first says, Paul has the ability to make the most amazing breakfast in the world. That works, but if you look at the second sentence that says, Paul makes the most amazing breakfast in the world, you've taken out some of the unnecessary fluff and made a sentence that flows a lot faster and gets the same point across. Whether it's writing a poem or writing a paper, more doesn't necessarily always mean better. Tip number 4, make your verbs specific. When you're wanting to show action in your poem, use action verbs that will help the reader paint a picture in their mind of what is happening. Here's an example where we get about as weak as we possibly can. 3 sentences. Paul goes to the finish line and wins the marathon. Jimmy goes slowly up the stairs. Pam goes, it's your turn to take out the garbage. We have 3 situations here all using goes to describe what action that person is taking. That's terrible, and we can do a lot better. So here we've replaced goes in all of the sentences. Paul sprints to the finish line and wins the marathon. Jimmy plods slowly up the stairs. And Pam shouts, it's your turn to take out the garbage. All of these are better sentences, not just because we've replaced the repetition of goes over and over, it's because we've given a verb that better describes what that person is doing. Tip 5, Use interesting and powerful adjectives. Use adjectives that will interest your reader and help them form the image you're trying to paint in your poem. So here's a sentence. The good salesperson won a good gift for having a good sales record. We already know that, number one, there's way too much repetition of the word good for that to be an okay sentence. However, we also know that good is not a strong adjective. If we're writing a poem, we need to have a stronger word to illustrate the aptitude of this salesman. This sentence is going to work a lot better with better adjectives. The first-rate salesperson won a valuable gift for having an excellent sales record. Sounds better and is way more descriptive than that last example. Finally, you better be using a dictionary and a thesaurus when you're doing any kind of writing. You may have a vast knowledge of words, but you don't know all of them. Use physical or digital resources to help you in your search for the right words. Using an actual physical copy of a dictionary or a thesaurus is going to be perfectly fine. You can also hop on a computer or use any device and look up the definitions for a word in the dictionary online in half a second. You can also do the same looking up words in a thesaurus online in the same amount of time and getting a big list of synonyms that will work great for when you are overusing a word or for when you want a stronger word. To close out our discussion today, don't forget the power of using figurative language in your poetry. We're going to discuss figurative language soon and how it can help. And use notes taken during this discussion to help in any writing you do, whether it's poetry, an essay, or whatever. Thanks, and have an excellent day.